Hello everyone, my name is Kami Akavan. I'm the Executive Director of the USC Dornsife Center for the Political Future. Our mission at the center is to transcend partisan politics and find solutions to some of the challenges that face our nation and our planet. You're joining us today because we are going to be featuring a student presentation for a class called Political Science 395. Students in this class have been researching all semester to find practical solutions to one of our nation's biggest challenges, which is political polarization. The solutions to polarization are daunting, and we believe that some of the solutions can be addressed at a systemic level. Can our political systems be reformed in a way that will reduce the amount of division that we have in our society and reduce the amount of division in our politics? I want to thank the Department of Political Science, with whom we partnered this semester, for hosting this class and allowing us to do this research. I want to thank Steph Damon, who's been an essential part of this classroom experience, student experience, and the success of this entire venture. I want to thank Professor Auerbach, now retired, for inspiring this class and leading it successfully for so many years. I also want to thank our partners for this semester. That is FixUS. It is a national nonpartisan project of the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. Its two leaders, Mike Murphy and Andrew Henry, were so helpful throughout this entire project, guiding the students, offering feedback, shaping the entire project, and putting us in touch with people who could really advance the research. So thank you, FixUS, very much. We appreciate all the good work that you do in general and for this project specifically. So for today's class, I want to leave you in the very capable hands of Samantha, Isabel, Shweta, Andrew, and Eleanor. Folks, it's your show.
Thank you everyone for coming out to listen to us present our research on political reforms and polarization, which we did for FixUS. The question that guided our research this semester was, which political reforms have the greatest chance of passage in reducing political polarization in the United States? So first, we're all going to introduce ourselves. I'm Isabel. I'm a junior studying political science.
I'm Shweta. I'm a sophomore studying political science and economics.
I'm Eleanor. I'm a sophomore studying public policy.
I'm Andrew. I'm a fifth-year senior studying philosophy, politics, and law.
I'm Samantha. I'm a senior, and I'm also studying philosophy, politics, and law.
So the reform I chose to research was open primaries. The thing about open primaries is there's a lot of variability in the types of open primaries and the degree to which primaries can be open. But in general terms of what it means for a primary to be open, voters have the freedom to choose which primary, whether partisan or not, to participate in. They can make this choice privately without their selection registering them as a voter of that party. And candidates from all parties participate in the same primary. And again, the degree of openness can vary across systems and from state to state, and that means that in some states there's a fully open primary or fully closed primary, while in other states there's a semi-open or semi-closed primary. So to go into detail, here are 4 different types of open primaries or primaries. These are by no means all types of primaries, but they are the 4 most common and the 4 I will be touching on in this presentation. So the fully open primary or jumbled primary, all voters, regardless of affiliation, participate in a single primary, and this is used in 4 states. In the open to unaffiliated primary, unaffiliated voters may choose which party primary to vote in, while voters registered to a party may only vote in that party's primary, which is used in 37 states. And the top 2 primary candidates are listed on the same ballot, and the top 2 vote getters advance to the general election, and this is used in 4 states. And the fully closed primary, where only voters registered to a specific party can participate in that party's primary, which is used in 9 states. And to visualize, here's a map from last month in which the primary election systems for each state is shown. And clearly the vast majority of states are only partially open, and there are more fully closed primary states than there are fully open ones. And this is all important because closed primaries have the capacity to increase polarization, while open primaries have the potential to decrease it. In closed primaries, independent voters who constitute a significant portion of the electorate are excluded from the primary process. Also, closed primaries in theory tend to favor candidates who align more closely with the ideological preferences of party core members, which may lead to the nomination of candidates with more extreme positions. And closed primaries also limit communication between candidates, as the focus is on catering to the base and not on the general electorate. In contrast, open primaries incentivize diverse coalitions among voters and present a more inclusive picture of the democratic process. They also include independent voters, who play a crucial role in selecting candidates who are more representative of a broader range of views. And open primaries have the potential to incentivize moderates, as candidates are motivated to adopt a more moderate position to appeal to a broader spectrum of voters. An example of this can be seen in the way candidates in Iowa operate in comparison to the way they operate in Nebraska. So in Iowa, where the state legislature party system is closed, voters rarely receive emails, phone calls, or other materials from candidates of the opposite party. This leads to a feeling of resentment, which can possibly increase the divide. In contrast, in Nebraska, where the primary system is open, because candidates need to appeal to all voters and not just those of their party, they're more likely to reach out to voters of the opposite party, and the electorate is more educated and less polarized as a result. Another example of the positive effects of open primaries can be seen in examining the top two primary in California. So under the old system, partisan gerrymandering and long-term demographic shifts solidified most districts as one-party districts. This led to 79% of elected officials winning without communicating with voters outside of their party. Proposition 14, introduced in 2010, proposed a system in which, regardless of party, all candidates were on one ballot, and the two candidates with the most votes qualified for the general. And 54% of voters in California approved this. The results in the years following were promising. An annual study by the Lucy Burns Institute of all state legislature elections in the country from 2008 to 2014 on the left shows California as the most competitive for the 2012 to 2014 season, and a 25% increase in competition over 2010. On the right, the implementation of the top two primary also saw incumbents defeated in record numbers. In 2012, 10 incumbents lost their re-election bids. Prop 14 also shifted focus from adversarial partisanship to functional governance. For example, several legislators publicly broke with their party on crucial votes in the years following, and the legislature has met its constitutional deadline for the budget approval each year, at least 5 years after the passing of Prop 14. In my research, I found a couple of common characteristics which lead to the implementation of open primaries, which would be past usage of blanket primaries and the ability to put referendums on a ballot. And I've also found a couple of roadblocks, which would be money and messaging. In terms of feasibility, we can look to 4 states, Nebraska, California, Washington, and Alaska, where open primaries have succeeded in being implemented. A common thread between all of them is that they all previously had blanket primaries in place. A blanket primary is like a top two primary in which all candidates are on the same ballot, but only the top two from each party advance instead of top two in general. And in all 4 states, this system was declared unconstitutional through the courts, but in response to these legal challenges, each state reinstated some form of open primary. A crucial factor to the success of open primaries in these states was the ability to put referendums on the ballot. And as we can see in the map, 23 states in the US provide for referendum processes, which is encouraging when evaluating the feasibility in other states. One roadblock to implementing open primaries would be money. Often parties who oppose open primaries have much more money to spend than the interest groups that want them. So an example of this would be in South Dakota, where a push for open primaries recently failed. The interest groups who wanted open primaries only had less than $1 million to spend on the issue, while parties had 40 to 70 million. Another roadblock would be messaging. Certain messaging works really well with voters, and that would be messaging that hinges on positive messages. That would be let all voters vote, give voters more choice, and let people vote for who they want. Messaging that doesn't usually work, and messaging that is usually used, is messaging which focuses on a negative outcome or kind of niche political topics. So that would be elect better politicians, cleaner government, or let more moderates vote, which is interesting because this is usually the messaging that people who want open primaries focus on. So my takeaways for open primaries is that they have the definite potential to decrease polarization, and when looking at how we want to implement them, we should focus on states which have had open primaries in the past, but they were possibly declared unconstitutional, and states with a referendum process, and also look out for money and messaging as possible roadblocks to this process. And now I will pass it up to Shweta.
Thank you, Isabel. Hi, today I'm going to be talking about ranked choice voting, or RCV. FixUS has already found that ranked choice voting produces more civil and positive campaigns than the dominant plurality system, but that its effects on polarization are inconclusive. This is because ranked choice voting is a relatively new voting approach, so there just isn't enough data yet. Thus, I looked at the feasibility of ranked choice to see if the implementation of this voting approach was even viable. For some background, there are two primary types of ranked choice voting in the United States. Single winner RCV is used to fill a singular seat. Using RCV here is useful because the seat will be filled by a consensus candidate that receives broad support. So an example of where we would use single winner RCV would be a mayoral election. Proportional RCV is used to fill multiple seats. These legislative body seats are filled proportionally to the electorate. An example of where we'd use proportional RCV would be a city council election. And this map shows where ranked choice voting is currently used. You can see Maine and Alaska are the two states that use ranked choice voting to its fullest extent, using it statewide. Here in California, we use ranked choice voting for local elections in some jurisdictions. The pink dots indicate where ranked choice is in use, and the dark gray dots indicate upcoming use. The first aspect of RCV I researched was voting experience. The first conclusion is that voters can understand how ranked choice voting works. Survey data has consistently shown that people are perfectly capable of using RCV. Additionally, a significant majority of first-time RCV voters say they understand how RCV works. Exit polling in New York City also found that there was minimal variability between racial and ethnic groups in understanding RCV. In general, voters support it. This table from New America shows how much different demographics support RCV. The conclusion from public support polling found that younger voters, Democrats, third-party supporters, and more educated respondents tend to evaluate RCV more positively than older voters, Republicans, major party supporters, and less educated respondents. There was also a trend that people with more experience using RCV were more likely to support it. Now let's look at the electoral outcomes when using RCV. This voting approach is meant to remove the spoiler effect from a third-party candidate. Voters won't feel like they're wasting their vote if they vote third-party because you're ranking your candidates instead of just choosing one. In practice, the results look promising. Some studies have shown that in RCV elections, women and people of color are more likely to run as candidates. For independent candidates, studies have shown that when these candidates run in RCV elections, they garner more support. And for more moderate candidates, studies from Maine, where RCV is widely used, has consistently shown greater ideological moderation, so depolarization. Depolarization has also been seen in campaigns. Candidates have an incentive to run civil, issues-based campaigns. and find common ground. In San Francisco's ranked choice voting elections, some of the most contested races have seen candidates endorsing like-minded opponents. Examples of this would be candidates sharing slate mailers and co-sponsoring fundraisers. Studies have also found that RCV has a neutral impact on incumbency. In general, since RCV is relatively new and experimental, data is somewhat hard to assess, and significant conclusions will need more time. RCV also saves taxpayer dollars. When looking at the cost benefit, I focused on municipal elections because I believe shifting municipalities to RCV is low-hanging fruit. Starting with local elections allows voters to become comfortable with this voting approach. Jumping to primary and federal elections doesn't seem as feasible because ranked choice voting is still experimental, and pushing for the widespread use of it in primaries will have more opposition until more data is collected. Looking at our own city of Los Angeles, currently the city uses a 2-round runoff system to elect its mayor, city attorney, city council, and controller. Because of the runoff election, LA taxpayers pay millions of dollars for administering a second election. Candidates also have to raise funds for the second election. Los Angeles, the LA Unified School District, and the LA Community College District are currently spending $14 million to administer a March primary and May runoff election. This table here shows LA County's runoff expenditures from 1993 to 2005. In a span of 13 years, Los Angeles, LAUSD, and LACCD have spent $30.9 million administering runoff elections. From 2001 to 2005, the city of Los Angeles alone spent $9.2 million. Specifically in 2005, they spent $4.7 million. And this was in 2005. Costs have only increased in recent years. Shifting municipalities to RCV clearly will save taxpayer dollars, millions of taxpayer dollars. I also want to note the cost of implementing ranked choice. I spoke with Deb Otis, the Director of Research from FairVote. From our conversation, I learned that all of the major manufacturers in the United States have ranked choice compatibility in the recent versions of their tabulators and software. Anyone that's using tabulators more than 20 years out of date is likely not going to have compatibility though, so they will need to upgrade their systems. However, states using out-of-date tabulators need to upgrade their systems within the next 5 years anyways, because of concerns like election security. Legislation for RCV is being introduced in multiple states. Also, as RCV is becoming more popular, it's also being passed more. 9 cities in the state of Nevada had ballot measures concerning ranked choice voting in 2022. Of these, only 2 didn't pass. The 2 counties where RCV legislation didn't pass were in the state of Washington. The failure of these bills is currently unclear, but new speculation suggests that Washington politicians are concerned about changing the voting approach from the one that got them elected. Other reasons for why RCV has not passed is likely because this voting approach is new and people are slow to trust. As more data is collected and significant conclusions are drawn, if the results are positive, public and political support will likely increase. Another concern is voter confusion. And although I have shown that data supports that people understand how RCV works, proper civic education is necessary. My takeaways were that people generally supported ranked choice voting, and when used, it is shown to be promising. But more research does need to be collected. Implementing ranked choice voting into municipal elections is low-hanging fruit because it has significant economic benefits since it eliminates the need for runoff elections. It also has a strong correlation with reducing party polarization for moderate candidates. So there are reasons to support RCV on both sides of the aisle. My next topic is voter suppression. The question I'm answering here is if there should be a focus on removing voter suppression to reduce party polarization. The exact question I aim to answer is, if voting is more accessible and convenient, will diverse voices be amplified? And the answer is yes. When more voices, not just the extremes of each major party, are heard, we will get voices from across the spectrum leading to depolarization. And the way to do that is by increasing voter turnout. Studies have shown that most Americans fall in and around the middle of the political spectrum. Too often, voters are called apathetic, but voter turnout has been increasing in the US. This graphic from FairVote provides a qualitative look at voter turnout in the 2020 general election. The darker the state, the higher the turnout. I calculated what the average turnout was here, and it was 68%. And the next graphic shows voter turnout in the 2018 midterm election. Here the average turnout was around 52%. So people are voting, but we definitely need to increase these percentages. But voter suppression is keeping people who do want to vote from voting. During a recent Texas primary election, close to 25,000 absentee ballots, comprising roughly 12% of the total ballots, were invalidated. These voters took the initiative to request, fill out, and mail their ballots. Of the 25,000 rejected mail-in ballots, approximately 14,000 belonged to Democrats and 10,000 belonged to Republicans. In most cases, county officials said ballots were rejected for failing to meet new, stricter ID requirements that require voters to provide their driver's license number or a partial social security number to vote by mail. Texas's strict eligibility criteria for voting by mail means that thousands of tossed votes most likely belong to people 65 and older, people with disabilities, and people voting out of state, like college students. These groups are known to vote differently from each other. This loss of diverse perspective only works to increase polarization. In 2020, more than 500,000 mail ballots were rejected across 23 states in the primaries. These votes can make all the difference in battleground states. According to a tally by the Washington Post, Michigan, Wisconsin, and Pennsylvania, which are all battleground states, tossed out more than 60,000 ballots during just the primaries. In 2020, New York absentee ballot problems plunged 2 congressional races into chaos for 6 weeks before a winner was declared. One of the races was New York's 12th congressional district, where the winner won by only 3,700 votes. Roughly 13,000 ballots were declared invalid in this race. When states implement accessible voting measures, it encourages a higher turnout, drawing people from diverse backgrounds to participate. Minnesota and Colorado are good case studies for this, since these states maintain consistently high voter turnout due to a combination of well-considered policies and a supportive statewide voter culture. For example, Minnesota permits a registered voter to vouch for a neighbor for same-day registration. Colorado makes voting accessible by mailing ballots to every registered voter's mailbox, providing prepaid postage, establishing convenient drop-off points, and purposely labeling their voting locations as voter service and polling centers. Passing these kinds of policies in every state isn't feasible, though. But there are other policies that are low-hanging solutions to low voter turnout. Research shows that language complexity shuts people out of the voting process. People can feel excluded because of legal jargon and terminology. Using layman's terms to explain propositions on ballots, for example, is a more accessible option. Automatic voter registration, or AVR, also stands out as a method in boosting participation, especially for voters who decide to participate last minute. Currently, 24 states have some level of AVR. A report by the Center for American Progress analyzed Oregon's AVR and found it increased registration and turnout, especially among voters who might not have otherwise participated, like younger Hispanic voters and older rural voters. Additionally, between January 2016 and August of 2017, Oregon's DMVs submitted more than 1.8 million AVR transactions to the Oregon Secretary of State for processing. By August of 2017, Oregon's AVR program registered almost 400,000 new potential voters. This approach leads to a more diverse and representative voter base, contributing to a less divided and more inclusive electoral landscape. And policies like using layman's terms and AVR are low-hanging fruit to increase our voter turnout. Another way to increase voter turnout is pre-registration, which Eleanor is going to talk about more now.
Thank you, Shweta. So yes, I'm going to go ahead and talk about pre-registration and its relationship with polarization. So first, I'm just going to give a quick overview of what pre-registration is. It allows teenagers, typically 16 or 17 years old, to register to vote early. This doesn't change the voting age, but it does allow them to be completely ready to vote when their time comes. So the minute they turn 18, their registration is automatically activated, and they pretty much are ready to vote and don't need to take any other preparative measures. So pre-registration varies pretty widely from state to state, as you can see in this map here. 16 states currently allow teenagers who are 16 years old to pre-register to vote. 4 states allow it at 17 years old, and 5 states designate some other age, like 17 and a half. So in total, 25 states have some form of pre-registration in place, while the other 25 do not. So why does this matter? Well, studies show that young adults struggle with voter registration and often encounter more barriers when it comes to registering, which is why pre-registration is so beneficial. According to the Center for American Progress and Generation Progress, young adults are learning to register during their most transient periods of time in their lives. They might be busy applying to colleges or have already moved away from home, and they often have heavier work and personal responsibilities. Many young adults also move out of their home state or county when they go to college, which can create confusion about registration rules and what address they should register under. So in 2012, 18 to 29-year-old non-voters most commonly cited not being registered as their reason for not voting. And then 538 also found that 19% of youth did not vote because they missed their registration deadline, and 6% of youth were told that their names weren't on their registered voting list after they attempted to vote. Pre-registration acts as a precursor to voting and helps youth avoid this kind of confusion, and by registering early, they avoid these last-minute problems. So notably, just as Shweta mentioned, pre-registration is coupled well with automatic voter registration. According to the Center for American Progress, 16 and 17-year-olds are much more likely to interact with registration agencies like the DMV, since this is the age when they normally go get their driver's permits and licenses. On the right, you can see that when you fill out a basic DMV application, the website will opt you into voter registration. And streamlining youth into the pre-registration process via the DMV ensures their exposure to registration. And studies show that AVR and pre-registration are the most effective when they are implemented together. So pre-registration increases youth turnout, and I'm going to explain how this connects to polarization in the next slide. But according to researchers from the American Journal of Political Science, this can be useful for narrowing participation gaps across demographic groups. So pre-registration increases turnout across a variety of subgroups, including by gender, race, and by party, which creates a more diverse electorate. And importantly, pre-registration is equally effective for both Democratic and Republican registrants. So it's not helping one party more than it is the other. So one 2009 study examining Florida's pre-registration programs found that youth who pre-registered to vote were 4.7% more likely to actually vote in its 2008 elections. Another 2016 study found that pre-registration programs increased youth turnout rates by 13% between 2000 and 2012. And then the Center for Information and Research on Civic Learning and Engagement, or CIRCLE, found that counties in the US with pre-registration in place had higher youth turnout by 9 percentage points compared with counties that did not. So how does this connect to polarization? How does higher youth participation tie into polarization? Well, youth overwhelmingly identify as politically independent, and large proportions of youth do not affiliate with Democrats and Republicans. So this chart from Gallup demonstrates the growth in the proportion of young people identifying as independent with each new generation. 52% of millennials and 52% of Gen Z identify as independent, over half of both of these generations. And Gen Z identifies the least with the two main parties, with only 17% identifying as Republican and less than a third identifying as Democrats. So increasing youth turnout can help create an electorate that is more politically diverse and has greater representation of independents, contributing to depolarization. And Michael Neblo, a professor and researcher at The Ohio State University, noted that a viable solution to polarization is making the box bigger, basically increasing new voter turnout to shift the political incentives driving polarization. And importantly, pre-registration is also low-hanging fruit. So research from FairVote shows that the cost of implementing this policy is relatively low, since it doesn't require a new database system, nor any new software, equipment, or personnel. I also spoke with Peter de Guzman, who is a researcher at Circle, and he agreed that pre-registration seems to have less barriers and costs and an easier path to passage than some other reforms. And pre-registration is a growing reform in the US, especially over the last 20 years. And then in this chart here, you can see that the population of youth pre-registered vote has increased over the past decade, with almost 1 million people pre-registered in 2020. So my main takeaways here from pre-registration are that this policy does increase youth turnout. This is supported by multiple studies and supple research. And paired with the fact that youth identify as overwhelmingly independent, pre-registration has the power to help politically diversify the electorate and improve registration of independent voters, which can help reduce polarization. Importantly, pre-registration is feasible and realistic and can be considered low-hanging fruit. That being said, there is notably limited research on pre-registration, especially in connection to polarization, and so more research should be supported and conducted. And so I'm going to talk about nonpartisan redistricting for my next topic. I'll first just give a quick overview of redistricting. So every 10 years, the federal government conducts the census to get an updated count of the country's population and to understand shifting demographics. In the following year or two, states redraw their district lines based on census data to reflect these population changes, which is called redistricting. And this process is handled by different bodies state to state. So FixUS has already established these 4 main types of bodies that handle redistricting. In most states, state legislatures are in control of the redistricting process, which is problematic since politicians often draw district lines in a way that will benefit themselves and improve their chances at re-election. Other states, however, have supplementary, semi-independent, and independent commissions in charge. And for the purposes of my research, I've focused on independent redistricting commissions, or IRCs, as research and experts agree that this leads to the least polarization. And I chose to look into California and Arizona's IRCs as case studies. So California uses a commission called the California Citizens Redistricting Commission, which was established as a result of the passage of Proposition 11. And this proposition removed the power to draw state legislative districts from the California legislature and gave this power to citizens. Then in 2010, Californians passed another proposition which gave citizens the power to draw congressional district lines. The California IRC is a 14-member commission. It's made up of 5 Dems, 5 Republicans, and 4 independents who are registered with neither main party. And there's an extremely strict process to become a commissioner on this IRC to ensure the most fairness and equity possible. All commission deliberations must take place in public hearings, and district lines must be drawn based on rank criteria. And the commission must receive public input through an open hearing process both before and after drawing their maps. So research does show that California IRC, it did increase competitiveness. And for the record, competitiveness means that it is uncertain or a toss-up which party will win a district because the race is more fair. A lack of competitiveness means that it is obvious which party will win, and this is often due to gerrymandering. So this table produced by the Public Policy Institute of California shows that competitiveness increased across the board under the 2011 IRC maps versus the 2001 maps drawn by the state legislature. So 14% of congressional districts were competitive under the independent maps versus just 6% under the state legislature maps. And then you can also see that competitiveness increased by 5 percentage points for state assembly races and by 3 percentage points for state senate races. And so generally, experts agree that IRCs are the best option for redistricting. Mindy Romero, the director of the Center for Inclusive Democracy, explained that independent citizen redistricting commissions are the best model we have right now in the country. Research shows that the California IRC largely satisfied expectations that it would produce plans that are fair to each major party and increase electoral competitiveness. In 2012, watchdog organizations actually found that 10 California U.S. House races were ranked as the most competitive in the country, and this was the first election held under the independent maps. And additionally, every year under the California IRC, maps have been more competitive than they were under the state legislature, with the exception of only 1 year. Other research finds that voters are much more likely to have faith in their government and redistricting process when an IRC is in place, which I'll talk a little bit more about later. And then here, I'd just like to note a few concerns with the California IRC that I found during my research. So first, some literature from Fair Vote disagrees and argues that increases in competitiveness were over-exaggerated. And there's also been some concerns about the demographic makeup of the IRC. Additionally, there have been some claims that politicians, parties, and special interest groups have influenced the map drawing. It is true that the California IRC map plans lean slightly in favor of Democrats, but the advantage is extremely small. Still, experts say that IRCs are a major improvement over state legislatures, although they're not entirely perfect. So next I'm going to talk about Arizona's IRC. This was also passed as a result of a proposition that Arizona voters supported in 2000. This commission is made up of only 5 members. The leaders of each party in both houses of the state legislature select one candidate to be commissioners. And so once these 4 partisan commissioners are set, they then select an independent chair from the list of candidates compiled by the Commission on Appellate Court Appointments. Like the California IRC, the Arizona IRC goes to great lengths to obtain public input and community feedback, and they even put on listening tours to collect input. So Arizona's IRC has also proven to increase in competitiveness. So as you can see in this chart on the left, under independent maps, 37.5% of House races were competitive in the first election cycle under the IRC, compared to just 31.3% under court maps and 28.3% under the state legislature maps. Additionally, under the IRC, 80% of legislative districts became more competitive, and the state also saw an increase in the number of congressional districts designated as competitive. And generally, IRCs improve public trust in the fairness of redistricting. So as you can see in the chart, when asked whether they thought redistricting was fair, residents in states with independent commissions answered yes, more often than those in states with politicians' redistricting commissions, and much more often than those in states with legislatures in control. And notably, respondents from Arizona answered yes to this question more frequently than citizens elsewhere. So finally, just to wrap up this section, I'll briefly discuss my takeaways. California and Arizona both implemented their successful IRCs via proposition, indicating that propositions are effective in establishing independent commissions and voter support is needed. As California and Arizona both demonstrated, it's important for IRCs to include public feedback as much as possible in their process, and they can request input, comments, and suggested maps to engage the community. IRCs do increase competitiveness, which contributes to depolarization, and IRCs are shown to improve public faith in the redistricting process, and experts and research widely agree that IRCs are the best option. And I'll pass it off to Andrew.
The election reforms we've heard about thus far all face institutional barriers to implementation. One of the biggest adversaries identified by supporters of reform is the role of money in politics. Money in politics has been identified as a major contributor to the distrust and pessimism towards American democracy, and the vast majority of Americans support reforms to limit the influence of money in American politics. For now, we'll be looking at the low-hanging fruit for addressing the role of unrestricted donors and their influence with campaign finance reform. The goal here is to reduce polarization. If candidates rely less on big donors, they'll be more beholden to their constituents and better represent their interests in cities and in Congress. They'll be more moderate and more likely to compromise. Additionally, as most Americans are moderate, candidates need to reduce their ideological extremism to appeal to the most voters, but this can't happen without voter mobilization, which I'll detail later. This would lead to a closing of the stark ideological gap between liberals and conservatives and decreased polarization. With this in mind, here are the most prevalent dark money reforms we've seen in the past few decades, and we'll analyze which ones actually can achieve the goal that we seek. Dark money can be described as funds either directly or indirectly spent on campaign in order to sway the outcome of an election. Here are the 4 types of dark money reforms that I'll be analyzing. Expenditure limits are limits on how much money can be spent either directly or indirectly on a political campaign. For example, most states already have some form of this, but many are voluntary, not legally binding, and 501c or super PAC donors remain anonymous. Disclosure laws are laws that actually require a donor to a political election to disclose their identity, the means, and the purpose of their donation. For example, Arizona last year passed a Voters' Right to Know Act from ballot initiative, 72% passage. And on the other hand, in Congress, at the federal level, the Disclose Act last year failed to pass 3 times. And this is another reason I'm going to be focusing more on state-level solutions. Clean election laws are laws that allocate public funds through taxation and surcharges in order to help candidates fund a campaign without the need for large donors. Some of these programs have a system in which candidates receive state funding when they demonstrate enough small contributions, and matching fund programs can fall under this as well. For example, we see this in Arizona, Connecticut, Maine, and Hawaii. Small donor mobilization laws are laws typically a part of clean election laws that incentivize and encourage individuals to make donations to their favorite candidate. For example, through voucher and matching programs, where voters are, one, sent vouchers worth $1 amount in the mail that they can give towards a candidate of their choosing, for example, in Seattle and New York City. And two, where small donations are matched within district by the city or state, if not more. For example, in New York City, there's a 6-to-1 donation match, and in Seattle, there's a 9-to-1 donation match, with the general principle being the less you donate, the more the state will match. Additionally, we saw a 10% increase in turnout in Seattle within the first election cycle of its implementation. New York City also has a cap on the amount of matching funds a candidate receives in order to prevent a massive extremist popular movement. If you're asking how popular these reforms are, these are a slew of Gallup and Pew polls showing that there's wide support, and as you can see, 80% of respondents support limiting the influence of money in politics. Additionally, the vast majority of Americans identify the influence of big donors as having much more leverage than the average voter. This is also a map of where these reforms have been implemented, and you can see that while not too widespread, these are legislatively viable. How do these reforms affect polarization? It's a very mixed bag here. Some reforms seem to work and some don't. Some say that small donors tend to support more extreme candidates, which would make a lot of the mobilization efforts completely counterproductive, so it's an important conversation. However, further research shows the opposite on some ends, and there's an argument here for increasing turnout and mobilization, which I'll get into later. There's also the issue of protracted legal battles. The Robert Court, generally over the past 20 years, has been very antagonistic towards many of these reforms, and this is a major barrier faced, especially on the federal level. There's also a lack of support for federal reforms, which I'll get into later. And I'll be looking at some pros and cons of these specific reforms. Pros for expenditure limits: they restrict the influence of big donor spending, increase trust in government, decrease polarization as a result. On the other hand, they're almost certainly unconstitutional under McCutcheon, since United buckling the First Amendment. There's a slew of precedent being put forth by the Roberts Court and previous, and it's very unpopular in Congress among Republican lawmakers as well. I'm not encouraged by this. Disclosure laws, on the pros, they increase trust in government and faith in the electoral process, increase voter mobilization, and decrease polarization as a result. However, these are possibly unconstitutional, not as much as expenditure limits. However, many super PAC lobbyists and legal scholars identify First Amendment restrictions as a possible defense. Clean election laws, they increase trust in government, increase voter mobilization, decrease role of donor spending, increase ease of entry for candidates, and therefore decrease polarization. However, people may not want to pay for it. This could lead to ease of entry for extreme candidates and may end up increasing polarization. I mentioned that people may not want to pay for these programs, and this is what I'm referring to. Participation rates in public financing programs have decreased in recent years, not simply because they don't work, but because their funding has been cut severely, and there's a lot of messaging issues which I'll get into in a second. This is a chart or a table of popularity ranking a slew of dark money reforms, specifically voucher programs, and you can see on a scale from 1 being support and 7 being oppose. These are generally unpopular. However, this is primarily a messaging problem and not an efficacy problem. Small donor mobilization increases competitiveness, increases public trust, encourages civic duty and literacy, encourages representation, encourages turnout, and therefore decreases polarization. On the other hand, this can encourage extreme candidates and increase polarization, but this is with a caveat I'll get into later. This chart represents the potential share of campaign contributions going to candidates under a new matching system in New York. As you can see, this would make small donors by far the largest share of campaign funding sources, and candidates would be significantly more obliged to appeal to and mobilize their constituents. This is what I've referred to as the small donor dilemma. It's a stark debate in political science between people who say that small donors are more polarized, which would make a lot of these mobilization efforts counterproductive. And on the other hand, there's also a large corpus of research showing that the opposite is true. and that they actually are not. The middle ground is what I tend to agree with, which is that small donors may be more polarized, but right now small donors are the most politically active ones. They aren't representative of the average voter or even the average American who are more moderate. The solution then is to increase the political engagement of these people. Takeaways: evidence of efficacy is mixed as it stands, and substantial legal barriers exist as well. But these reforms can work if we pair them with other electoral reforms like the ones mentioned so far that will bring out more moderate candidates and voters alike. Keep in mind that there is not overwhelming evidence of efficacy, so we'll focus on the low-hanging fruit with a prudent, narrow approach that could work. Keep pushing for smart, clean election reform like in Arizona, Connecticut, and Maine to encourage voter engagement and to encourage candidates to be less beholden to big donors. This would help candidates with a greater diversity of opinions, not just extremists, get a platform. Increase voter turnout through matching and voucher programs that increase political engagement from previously apolitical Americans like we see in New York City and Seattle. These are supported by also many political scientists, Michael Malbin, Brian McCabe, and Jennifer Herwig. Finally, utilize unintrusive disclosure laws to build public trust and avoid legal pushback, including increases in political literacy and access to candidate information. Arizona is off to a good start with their Voters' Right to Know Act, but the legal pushback could be growing. Something like a simple requirement that super PAC ads acknowledge that they are non-disclosure, that they are a non-disclosure organization at the end of their ads could be unintrusive and easy to pass. And finally, hearkening on the point made throughout this section, dark money reforms by themselves are not the sole solution. And now I'll be handing it over to Samantha.
Thank you, Andrew. So I will be focusing on bridging the aisle in both the physical and digital spheres. So it's difficult to measure the relationship between polarization and social media, but the two are believed to be heavily related. A 2020 study found that users who were refrained from using Facebook actually held less polarized views than users who continued using the platform during that time. Studies have shown that there's a positive correlation between social media and polarization, but also a positive correlation between political knowledge and participation. Democrats and Republicans actually tend to think that they dislike each other more than they really do. This leads to increased polarization and fragmentation. The amount of Americans consistently expressing conservative versus liberal opinions has more than doubled over the past 20 years, from 10% to 21%. 92% of Republicans are to the right of the median Democrat, and 94% of Democrats are to the left of the median Republican. Since 1994, the share of individuals holding an extremely negative view of the opposing party has doubled. These views usually consist of other parties' policies are so misguided that they threaten the nation's well-being. One of the suggestions that's been made is that platforms should facilitate more interactions across the aisle by hiring third-party researchers to measure these interactions. However, these suggestions are less central and relevant to recent cases and litigation arising from state regulations, some of which we'll look into now. So, there's a minimal amount of case law exploring the constitutionality of social media regulations. It's now coming up because states are putting out more regulations. Therefore, though, judges are hesitant to apply old case law to novel applications. So there are two pending cases, O'Connor-Ratcliffe and Linked. These two cases involve First Amendment violations, or they're claiming as such. Essentially, the petitioner is someone who was blocked or their comments were deleted on a public page of a government individual. So in Morthy, the federal government coerced social media companies to downgrade private posts regarding sensitive issues. The court allowed this to continue. The dissent, which is not legally binding, but dicta, warned against First Amendment violations. Similarly, in Net Choice, a Texas bill prohibited platforms from censoring users based on their viewpoint. It established requirements for platforms so users could appeal their decisions and accounted for more transparency. The court granted relief against Texas. In the dissent, again, not binding, it warned against First Amendment violations and the novel application of previous case law. One thing that I thought was really interesting was that the Texas bill only applied to platforms with 50 million active users in the US that had a significant amount of influence to shut out disfavored speakers. The available case law illustrates content regulation in a negative light, making decision-based regulations a more feasible avenue to pursue. Looking into legislation that's passed, 11 states have enacted bills or adopted resolutions regulating social media in some regard. The majority, which we can see here, are red, but there are some blue. A lot of the past legislation has focused on protecting minors from harmful content, but it has also been assigning more liability, so we are trending in that direction. 35 states have pending legislation, 2 of which we'll look into now. Arkansas passed the Social Media Safety Act. This involved a lot of liability and duties imposed for the publication and distribution of material harmful to minors. It also pushed for age verification. In Utah, the Social Media Regulation Act required that platforms verify the age of their residents or obtain the consent of the guardian before individuals under a certain age can open an account. They limited the hours of usage, they encouraged guardian discretion, and similar aspects. Again, successful legislation is not censorship. There's more emphasis on design-based changes. So what do those changes look like? Enforcement and censorship don't work, but design changes do because it doesn't regulate speech and avoids claims of First Amendment violations and government censorship. So this involves removing engagement incentives like likes, comments, and shares to boost posts. It also involves surveying and improving user experiences. So that would be upvoting and downvoting content. For example, you would upvote content that is relevant, that is informative. You would downvote content that is more polarizing and more opinion-based. The other important aspect is assigning liability. Platforms can sometimes be liable for the choices they make and the content that they promote, and they should be held accountable. Next is age restrictions. There's a wide support for raising the age of internet adulthood to 16, and it has higher support because of the recent improvement in tech as far as age verification. Data transparency is a little bit more obvious. I think it's something that a lot of people champion, but between users, government officials, and researchers, it can make a lot of headway. Finally, I'd like to mention regulating government official speech on social media. We'll touch more on it a little bit later, but this is something that has less regulation than anything else. Shifting the culture out of the digital sphere is also a necessary reform. For that, we look to the Select Committee on the Modernization of Congress. It was formed in January 2019 to investigate, study, and hold public hearings to develop recommendations that make Congress more effective, efficient, and transparent. Unfortunately, it is no longer standing. It was considered during its time, though, to be one of the only truly bipartisan committees on Congress with an equal number of Democrats and Republicans. It has 202 recommendations that were passed, and these past recommendations typically focused on new members, inclusivity, and accessibility to resources. Partially implemented or failed measures typically involved more technical and required more work-intensive changes. This involved dual sponsorship of bills and bipartisan gathering spaces. Efforts that were more widely supported and eventually passed. Examples include nonpartisan programming during new member orientations and more bipartisan dinners in the Library of Congress. Next is organized seating. So it's a typical Senate tradition that Democrats traditionally sit on the presiding officer's right and Republicans on the left. However, the Modernization Committee found success with seating charts that mixed both parties and specific meeting locations with roundtables as they facilitated more conversation. Bipartisan events also facilitate relationship building with a great success. There's a need for both informal and formal events, however. So informal events would be more like baseball games, barbecues, and retreats, and formal events would be more like the nonpartisan programming as a part of new member orientation. Finally, the congressional calendar should be looked into as far as how time is spent in DC and how much time is spent in DC versus in representatives' home communities. A shift in culture is a relatively obvious answer, making it more feasible than some other reforms. Of course, it won't happen overnight, but establishing certain expectations early on will set a better precedent for increased interaction across the aisle and subsequent decrease in polarization. So to recap, my takeaways first are that design-based regulations for social media are of a greater benefit than content-based regulations, as these usually get caught for First Amendment violations in court. Second is assigning liability, increasing age restrictions, and transparency across social media platforms. Finally, to facilitate more physical relationship building through scheduled events, seating charts, and calendar changes, we can decrease polarization. Now for a recap.
Bottom line is that all of these reforms go hand in hand in decreasing polarization, but of course, some reforms are more feasible than others. So for open primaries, they're definitely feasible in that they've been enacted in certain states recently, but of course that feasibility comes with caveats, that being they're more likely to pass in states with referendums and states who have had blanket primaries in the past, and that we should keep an eye out for money and messaging as possible roadblocks to the implementation.
For ranked choice voting, municipal elections seem to currently be the most viable elections to implement ranked choice voting because voters can become more comfortable with RCV, and these elections can also be used to collect more data to support large-scale implementation. In terms of voter suppression, policies like using layman terms on ballots to explain propositions and automatic voter registration are low-hanging fruit to make voting more accessible.
So for pre-registration, this is a very feasible and realistic policy, and it has relatively low cost. IRCs are a little bit less feasible to implement, especially since state legislatures don't want to give up their own power, but they can be established via proposition.
The feasibility of money in politics reforms is mixed. At the federal level, in terms of the immediate future, not so much. At the state level, it is possible within a narrow scope, but additionally more empirical evidence and research is necessary to form a solid conclusion.
As we're seeing more social media regulations come up to the courts, it is increasingly likely that regulation-based reforms don't work, but design change does. And finally, that increasing interaction across the aisle by facilitating more opportunities for conversation and events will also decrease polarization. Thank you all so much for your time. We really appreciate this opportunity to do research. We've loved working together and for FixUS. Thank you.
Bravo, 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 bravo. You guys were fabulous. So proud of you all. That was the formal presentation component. And for now, we're going to invite FixUS to join us on screen so that you can ask whatever questions that you have with these students. We'll have a conversation from this point out, and it'll be questions from FixUS to students and from students to FixUS, so we can explore the topics that they raised a little more fully. So with that said, Mike, Andrew, what'd you think?
You know, I don't like the hand clap feature on Zoom because you actually can't hear the applause. Because I was cheering here, saying that was so good. That was really, really good. Thank you all. I've enjoyed working with you all too. I know Andrew has in the sessions we've had. So thank you very much. Andrew, what'd you think?
Yeah, no, I was going to say the exact same thing. I was hoping that my applause showed up somewhere on a screen for you guys, but really appreciated each of your presentations, and especially at the end there, you know, all of you kind of pulling together for the bottom line and just helping give that summary and show again, what this whole project is about is the breadth of the problem we face and the variety of reforms out there, but you guys individually gave really good summaries, and overall, you know, was very happy by the presentation. So thank you guys.
Yeah, let me build on that too and just say, again, thank you all for doing this. And this is going to be immensely helpful for us. You know, as we talked with you on the kind of development of this several times and heard some of the interim findings, to get the final one, it's already given me, Andrew, a little bit of ideas to like just figuring out how we can help use your findings and kind of share them within folks on our network to think about these things. I think it's just going to be really, really useful. So I just want to double down on that. So we can use the rest of this to kind of ask questions, I guess. Is that what we're going to do? If so, all right. I got a lot. Okay, so Andrew, let's go back and forth. Okay, like I'll do one and jump in here too. Okay. Here's my first question. Anyone can answer this. I'm curious what you all think here. It was kind of alluded to a little bit throughout, but I'm really curious what you all think as you kind of step back and evaluate all your research on this, is that while you all kind of tried to tackle individual pieces of this and different types of reforms, there's definitely interaction effects, okay, between a lot of these, that when one presents them kind of in isolation, sometimes can get a little bit missed, right? What do you all think about that? Like, where did you find or what is your sense and what you found on where the key sort of interaction effects are here between some of the different things you've looked at? Where, if anywhere, do you think the research kind of shows that? Really curious what any of you all think about that. And a lot of you could answer that because it's like there's all sorts of different interaction effects potentially here across these.
Well, me and Eleanor, we both were looking at increasing voter turnout specifically. Me for voter suppression through AVR, and Eleanor through pre-registration. And we made that connection in our presentation, but there's definitely a connection there for first registering and then having these people actually show up to the polls.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, when I spoke to Peter DeGuzman, who works at Circle, he talked about the importance of facilitative voter election policies. So that's like AVR, online voter registration, pre-registration, other like measures like that, and how important it is for all of them to work together in making it easier for voters to register to vote and actually vote.
Right, Andrew, go.
So I'm curious, as each of you guys, proceeded through the course of the project and, zeroed in on the, the reform area you were interested in looking at. How would you say that your personal thoughts, like whether it's like level of positivity, level of negativity, how effective, ineffective you thought that this idea was? How has that changed from when you were first starting out, maybe picked this idea, or maybe it was in your mind the whole time versus presenting today? Are you more positive, less positive? What are your thoughts on the topic that you picked?
I can go first. So I didn't know a whole lot about my topic at the beginning of this journey. I think I knew a lot that, I mean, people are very concerned about data privacy and how it impacts their lives and their personal information. I learned a lot about the different cases that are involved, and that was something that was really interesting to me because of my legal background, and that's what the career I hope to go into is. I think that there is a lot of progress to be made as far as design-based regulations, and I think we are seeing them being implemented. Instagram, I mean, I haven't read articles about this or anything, but while I was scrolling through my own feed, I'm seeing more questions about, like, are you enjoying this content? Is this something that you're interested in? And things like that. And that's exactly what we mentioned in this presentation. So I am more hopeful in that regard. I think the shifting the culture in this physical sphere is a little bit more up to the people that are actually representing us to implement. But overall, I have a very positive view.
I can go next. So for pre-registration, I knew a fair bit about it beforehand, but and I knew that pre-registration has been proven to increase turnout, but I was really interested in the polarization side. And I think the argument about the connection between turnout and youth highly identifying as independent is really interesting. I think pre-registration, looking into this, has made me more hopeful that states are going to pass this policy at like a wider level, I suppose. This policy has been growing among states in the US, and the fact that half of US states have it in place is already really great. But one of the things that did surprise me was there is just not a ton of literature out there about pre-registration, especially pre-registration and polarization. So I would really like to see more research done on this. I think that sometimes researchers can forget about youth because there's so many other minority populations to look at, but this is a really interesting area that I think should be explored. And then in terms of redistricting commissions, I think I felt more hopeful about IRCs just because of propositions being the gateway to establishing IRCs. But I think there are like some questions about how many states would actually pass IRCs, because that would require it to be put on the ballot and then voters to vote on it as a proposition. And in states where state legislatures are in charge of redistricting, they're not going to just willingly hand over their redistricting power to an independent commission. So there's some, I guess, there's a little bit less like positive vibes there, but overall, I think voters have the power to vote on propositions and put them in place.
Also for money in politics, I think generally I was going into it with a more popular assumption, which is that if we get rid of money in politics, unrelated to polarization specifically, but that it'll make the problems better, basically. And through researching this, come to find out that there's a large school of thought that's saying that this is actually completely counterproductive and that it'll actually make the problems worse. Definitely tempered my enthusiasm a bit. And I wouldn't say that I'm pessimistic about these reforms, but my opinion is a lot more nuanced now, and not just full scale, full steam ahead. Let's just implement all these reforms wide scale.
I can go next. So for ranked choice voting, I've always been really interested in it, and I've always been quite hopeful about implementing it in different places. But I was really surprised in my research by how inconclusive the data was and how much more data needs to be collected for more significant conclusions to be drawn. But I am still hopeful that, because in my opinion, I think that it just is going to make so many improvements. It's going to save money. It's going to depolarize. Hopefully that can be more supported with more data. But I think that I'm going to still be hopeful about this and enthusiastic about it. And for voter suppression, I knew like a bit, but I didn't know the scale to which some voter suppression laws have on different states. And so looking at the numbers was really surprising and honestly like shocking. And so I am hopeful that we can remove these voter suppression laws and at least make voting more accessible to the majority of the electorate.
Excuse me. For open primaries, I have worked with open primaries in the past, and of course during that time I was incredibly hopeful in their implementation and their positive effects. But during my research, seeing the roadblocks and the caveats to implementation kind of tempered my enthusiasm as well. But in the end, the research has shown that it is feasible and they do have positive effects. So I guess all in all, I'm still hopeful.
Good question, Andrew. I'm going to try one too that tries to get similar things. See if we can get many of you to kind of answer this. Let me try this one. In some ways, as we kind of set this out with you all, you were bound a little bit by the feasibility argument, right? It was kind of like, we got to kind of look at things that already exist, right? We're kind of on the, like, okay, like, you know what I mean by that, right? I want you to forget about that, right? I actually want you using sort of what you've done now and kind of learned a lot about, you've learned more about some mechanics of kind of reforms now, right? Of like the types of things people are looking at to change. If you took yourself out of that limitation on the feasibility now for a second, and just kind of thinking about like, if this reform or change happened because of what I've learned about some incentives here, is there a reform that interests you? Is there another kind of reform idea that gives you enthusiasm if you weren't bound by the sort of feasibility constraint? Do you understand the question I'm asking?
For mine especially, there's a big one, which is the American Promise amendment to the Constitution. In terms of feasibility, I don't see it as very feasible, but if that were implemented, that would be a complete restriction on super PACs and a complete requirement of disclosure, complete requirement of expenditure limits and contributions. It would be super widespread. It would rebalance the amount of the amount that candidates have to be beholden to donors versus constituents, and that would be super widespread. But that's what I would look at if I didn't have any feasibility limitations.
For me, if I didn't have any feasibility limitations, I would look into civic education. That was something I started off like thinking that I was going to research, but it's just really unrealistic, especially with just the controversy over state education policies and like the woke controversy thing in like Florida, for example. It's just really unrealistic that civic education would be implemented in high schools, in all public high schools like across the US. Obviously, some high schools do have some form of civic education, but if there were no feasibility problems, I would really like to see, really, I guess, strong civic education curricula in public education, public high schools across the US. I think, like the pre-registration argument, it helps prepare youth to register to vote. It helps prepare them to learn about the different parties and learn that there's more than just two parties. And it also helps prepare them in terms of when they move to college, how do they vote? How do they get their absentee ballot? Do they need to change their address and other things like that? And when I talked with Peter, like I mentioned earlier, he also talked about the importance of civic education, and that civic education coupled with other youth outreach methods like pre-registration would be really powerful in high schools. But it's just bounded by the feasibility, yeah.
For me, I think that ranked choice voting would be really useful in every single election. So if I didn't have the feasibility restriction, I would have definitely done more research into how ranked choice voting would affect primaries and what that would look like, and even general elections. And then for voter suppression, I would definitely research voter ID requirements or like voter ID requirements for registering to vote. I didn't think that would be very feasible. I don't see a lot of states getting rid of their voter ID laws, but if I didn't have the restriction, I would have definitely done research into that.
For me, this is completely unfeasible, but I'm really interested in misinformation in terms of politics, and the way that I think it's one of the biggest problems facing politics today and a really big contributor to polarization. But there's really just no way you can kind of combat it on a federal level because of the First Amendment, but that's what I would focus on.
I was actually going to say misinformation and disinformation as well, but instead I'll mention media literacy. A lot of the legislations that have been recommended and have ultimately failed have involved some element of media literacy or another, and I thought that was really interesting.
Well, I really wish we could wave the magic wand and make each of those things happen. We haven't figured out that technology yet, but if we do, we'll definitely let you know. I guess next question I would ask is, previous question was more about what was your kind of learning process about your reform as you moved along with the project, and, changing, like growing or shrinking optimism about the reform that you chose. I guess I would ask of, your peers here, the reform or reforms that they chose, whose would you say you are most optimistic about? I guess you could look at that in a couple of ways, whether it is the most, maybe the fewest or smallest roadblocks in the way, or maybe you think it would have the biggest impact. Maybe you'd have higher roadblocks, but perhaps if it were enacted, would have the biggest impact. But of your peers, whose reform, not your own, are you most optimistic about?
I think Eleanor's work on pre-registration, she explained that it is very feasible. And so I think that implementing that would be countrywide would be a great thing. And so I think I would say that.
I would probably say open primaries, which Isabel looked into. I think that there are some major roadblocks there, but opening up primaries would encourage a lot of independent and moderate voters to participate in the primary elections. We see a lot of, I guess, more extreme and hyper engaged citizens vote in open primaries, and a lot of people who don't feel like they can fit into either of the main parties kind of are excluded from primaries. So I think open primaries could have a really large impact in improving turnout and also depolarization.
Well, I think Shweta on AVR is what I'm most optimistic about, especially hearing about Oregon and the many voters who were registered after AVR was implemented.
I would also probably say pre-registration. It seems like something that's pretty unintrusive legally, but also with a lot of wide-ranging implications, improving turnout and things like that.
I would also say Isabel's open primaries, the work that she did there, because it just, I mean, it's been successful before. There are roadblocks, but you address those. And I think with the time and effort and education, we can address those.
Let me try this question. I think it was Andrew before. I was you said something that really resonated with me about like realizing a lot of this stuff is nuanced, right? Like when you started looking into this, and like that really resonates to me. And Andrew obviously shares this view. It's my own journey is kind of looking into this stuff. One gets very humbled very quickly about how challenging this is and how nuanced some of this stuff is. Now, I use that as the precursor to ask a question about one of the things that was being raised throughout presentations that I just am actually not at all as knowledgeable on, and immediately sort of raises to me some of these nuanced, challenging sort of questions. And this relates to the turnout issue, right? A lot of what you were presenting in different ways, which was really interesting, was getting at the ideas to increase turnout, right, or voter participation in some ways, can have a benefit of polarization, right? That was really interesting, and it's actually something I haven't heard a lot before. But here's where I get the humility sort of nuanced stuff, and I'm just curious what do you think about this and how you react to this. One argument is, let's take the pre-registration for increased turnout, right? You showed the statistics about younger voters being independent. Well, I've seen a lot of studies, right, that independents in general, and maybe I think young independents, but I'm not sure. Independents in general, they're not as independent as one would think, right? That they're actually not, they might be nominally independent, but they might not be ideologically independent or moderate in ideologically temperament. So therefore, it might actually not impact, right? So that's one question in a second to respond to see if you've seen any of that, if you've seen any of that, or if there's any kind of nuance there that's worth thinking about, right? The second question I have is like, have you seen anything? Because I've heard arguments about, well, maybe the turnout does benefit, okay? Maybe the turnout argument actually does benefit one political side more than the other, right? Well, it's possible that that helps polarization too, right? Because maybe in some ways, or polarization depending on how it's defined. If polarization meaning more effective governments and actually getting stuff done, well, there was a huge part of our history in this country where, because one party controlled the House of Representatives for such a long period of time, the incentive was in place to actually not have as much fighting because the other party knew they couldn't win. So they kind of like were incentivized to kind of work with that. You follow me? So this is like, it's a long-winded way of getting at, I'm curious what you think about when you're talking about how turnout decreases polarization. Have you seen or have you thought about some of these other kind of potentially nuanced arguments kind of against this, or what it means that, well, wait a second, maybe independents aren't really independent, therefore that might matter, or maybe it actually results in one party when, more control, and that actually helps in different ways.
I could say, I think, especially in terms of turnout, first of all, the majority of Americans, it is a slim margin, but the majority of Americans are moderate, ideologically moderate, and especially even when we look at like independent voters specifically, even though they may not fall, or they may have opinions that fall into both camps, Republican or liberal or conservative. Just the fact that if more of these independents are mobilized, either way, candidates would have to reach across the aisle in order to appeal to these diverse opinions. So.
Yeah, and just to add on to that, so with the pre-registration argument, there's definitely some nuance. And so I talked to a couple different experts, so with Peter and then Mindy from the Center for Inclusive Democracy. And there are two kind of larger nuance points that I'll mention here is that one, Mindy explained that just because someone registers as an independent, it doesn't necessarily mean that they will vote for an independent candidate in an election, which is a pretty big like nuance factor. And then Peter also mentioned that for young voters, they really care about certain issues, and some of these issues like climate change or gun control that they're super engaged on have their own homes within the two-party system. But like Andrew said, and also when I talked to Peter, he was talking about by increasing the registration rates of youth who are independent, it does incentivize politicians to be less polarized, to reach out more to independent and moderate voters, because they have to consider them in like their campaign and their policies, etc. Especially if youth voter turnout is on the rise, or if youth voter registration is on the rise. So there's definitely some nuance there, but it still has the potential to decrease polarization and still forces politicians into being less polarized.
Yeah, and there's definitely some nuance to voter suppression, but like I totally agree with what Andrew and Eleanor said. But when I was giving my different examples of groups that will have more voter turnout, so when Oregon did their AVR registration, and they had I looked at a report and it said younger Hispanic voters were more likely to turn out to vote because of AVR. So these people are more likely to vote more liberally, while this also increased older rural voter turnout, and those people are more likely to vote more conservatively. So it's on both sides too. So that would account to depolarization.
Fascinating. That's really helpful. And just to be clear, in case it wasn't clear in the outset, like sort of the nuance stuff here is also like the goal of increasing the people that participate in our democracy is a goal that, I mean, everyone should agree with, I would think, in one way or another, right? There's trade-offs, right? You got to do it in ways that have integrity and all these kind of things. But like, I think that the goal of increasing the amount, like, that should be a no-brainer. It's not as clear a no-brainer of like how when one does that, it then decreases the polarized system, right? It's not as clear the connection there. So it's just, that's why I wanted to ask the questions. I'm talking about the goals and sort of the end outcome. So very helpful. Thank you. Andrew, you got another one?
Yeah. Samantha, I think it was you, but I apologize if my memory is incorrect. I thought you mentioned in your portion of the presentation talking about basically I guess to borrow a term from More in Common, one of our partners, a perception gap. People thinking that group X thinks Y, and Y is way far away, this terrible thought, but it's actually way closer. Like that gap is way smaller, perhaps non-existent. And that seeing those things very much shocks people. Yeah, More in Common has produced many reports that even for someone like me, same thing for Mike, like when we're in this space, seeing these numbers of getting a much more realistic expectation, a much more, much better place setter of where people actually fall answering difficult questions, and having those perceptions challenged is key. And so seeing that in your presentation made me think about each of your presentations, again, kind of going over to like the course of this, working through this project for each of you. Was there, and I'm sure, you know, some of this came up in your presentations themselves, like, you know, you talked a little bit about how your thoughts about these things changed over the course of the project. And, you know, you talked about the pros and cons in each of your presentations. But I'm curious, for each of your reforms in the course of your researching this, did you have a moment where you encountered a piece of, like you encountered an article or an op-ed or, you know, something else that really challenged the way you thought about your chosen reform or reforms? And how did that impact you? Like, how did that thing that really clicked with you and made you see this reform or reforms a different way? What was that thing for you? And, you know, how did you respond to seeing that surprise?
So in my in my research, in a few of my other classes, in my freshman year, I actually took a class on current moral and social issues. It was a philosophy course. And I think it was one of the academic papers that we read. It suggested that there should be a panel of people that are just essentially employed in like flagging material that's problematic or polarizing particularly. I also was of the opinion originally that, you know, maybe if we're seeing people stuck in echo chambers and you know, similar situations where they're just seeing more and more of the content that they agree with, and so it's kind of pushing them in a certain direction, you can pair it with an opposing view. And maybe they can have at least exposure to the other view and realize that, you know, it might not be exactly what they think. I was talking to Ravi Iyer, who actually works at the USC Neely Center, and he essentially was of the opinion that it won't do as much as we think it will. And that was really interesting to me because I originally thought, yeah, if you show people and prove that there are other views, then, you know, obviously they'll kind of come more towards the center rather than more towards their, you know, either right or left preferred. And so that's when I started figuring out the design-based regulations and making changes in that regard. And so those make actually quite a bit of sense because you're not really isolating people, you're not censoring people. And so I think that's why it's more feasible. But it was definitely something that I hadn't really considered before as an alternative to social media reform to decrease polarization.
Folks, we are right about at time. We've asked so many good questions, had so many great answers. I do want to once again thank the Committee for Responsible Federal Budget. You are a mighty and impressive organization. We are honored to partner with you and the FixUS project. Mike and Andrew, been a personal pleasure as well. Of all the presentations we've seen over the years, for me, this was one of the best ones we've seen. So I'm glad that you got to get the benefit of seeing the best of what these USC students are capable of.